I just want to welcome everyone to our How I Got into Sports Tech Adaptive Sports Technology panels. I'm Emma Henzis, WIS Marketing and Content Manager. We're joined by Seong-Hee Yoon, Senior Rehabilitation Engineer at Michigan Medicine and Director of Technology and Innovation for UMAISE. Hopefully Sam Gardner will be coming. He's the lead para applied performance sciences and senior strength and conditioning coach at USOPC, the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee. And then we're also joined by Kendall Gretsch, USP Nordic and Biathlon and USAT para triathlon, three-time Paralympian and six-time Paralympic medalist. So I welcome you all, and we're so excited to have you all here. So we're just going to get started. Hopefully Sam will come through, but our panelists will discuss how adaptive technology allows athletes with disabilities to participate in sports. This webinar will focus on how our panelists create and use accessible technology to overcome barriers to participating in sports. They'll share their journeys to their current roles and what they think the future of adaptive sports tech will look like. So I would love to get started. Kendall and Seong-Hee, would you please introduce yourself and tell us your background of how you got into the role you're in now? We all know that the journey to success isn't a straight line up. So how did you get there? And Seong-Hee, you could start first.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you, WIS, for having us. I'm so excited for this talk. My name is Seong-Hee Yoon, and as Emma mentioned, I am a rehab engineer at Michigan Medicine, and I am part of UMAISE, which is the University of Michigan's Adaptive and Inclusive Sports Experience. We're an adaptive sports program based out of Ann Arbor. Should I talk about just how I got here, or kind of like how I got here into like a day in the life of a rehab engineer kind of thing?
Yeah, I would first maybe start with like how you got to where you are, and then we'll come back to your day to day.
For sure. Well, I have a slide that I guess I could share.
Yeah.
Let me start the slideshow first. Oh, no. Is it okay if I just leave it on the slide? Because I think when I start the slideshow, it pushes over to another screen. Perfect. So I studied biomedical engineering at UNC Chapel Hill, just like with very own Mary Lou, go Heels. And I loved engineering because of the creativity aspect of it. And I didn't know anything about rehab engineering at the time, but my senior year, I ended up doing the section for the capstone section for working with people with disabilities, and ended up finding my own company called BrailleBot. So on the side, when I'm not working at Michigan Medicine, currently I run a business manufacturing Braille educational toys, and the company's named BrailleBot. From there, I got involved with my professional organization, which is RESNA, and that's the Rehabilitation Engineering and Assistive Technology Society of North America. My life involves a lot of acronyms. So at RESNA, currently I'm on the board of directors, and RESNA is the professional society that gives me my certification, ATP, which is Assistive Technology Professional, and RET, which is Rehab Engineering Technologist. Michigan Medicine is currently where I am. So from UNC, I made my way over to the Wolverine territory in Ann Arbor. And my joke is that Michigan pays for my UNC bills. So I just root for Michigan football. That's it. So Michigan Medicine, I'm a senior rehab engineer. That means that I see patients with disabilities and use technology to help them. And from Michigan Medicine, all of the rest of this project got started. So I got involved in UMAISE, which is adaptive sports, and Tinker Toy Box, which is adaptive toys, and Impart, which is adaptive game. It's an adaptive gaming program. So kind of like from engineering school, I found my way into working with people with disabilities. And then once I got to Michigan Medicine, there was a need for an adaptive sports program. So I worked with the recreational therapy department here at Michigan Medicine and found my way into UMAISE. So I'm kind of the techie nerd geek of the adaptive sports program here. Kendall?
Love it. Thank you, Seong-Hee. Yeah, Kendall, we'd love to hear about your background as well.
Okay. Yeah, hi everyone. So I guess I'll kind of share how I got into adaptive sports and kind of where I am today. So yeah, I grew up very like active and as a participant in sport, but I would never say I was into like competitive sports. It was kind of just a fun outlet for me because I really didn't know about the adaptive sport world and what the Paralympics were. And yeah, so I didn't find out about the Paralympics or that I even qualified for them until I was in college. And yeah, kind of as soon as I found that, I really kind of jumped into it head first and started working or I guess training with a paratriathlon club based in Chicago called Dare to Try. And yeah, they really opened up my world to the whole adaptive sports world. And so I started competing in triathlons. And then, yeah, it kind of just snowballed from there. I started competing and eventually kind of transitioned from working while training and competing. And now I'm a full-time athlete and I compete both in a summer sport, so paratriathlon, which is swim, bike, run for those that aren't familiar. And then I also do a Nordic winter sport, Nordic skiing. Yeah, so I've been competing since 2014 internationally. And I would say been full-time training and competing since about 2019. And since then, I've been to 3 Paralympic Games, so 2 winter, 2018 in Pyeongchang, and then 2022 in Beijing, and then 1 summer games in Tokyo.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We are really happy to have you here, and we're also thrilled that Sam was able to join us. Sam, I hope that seems like you're coming in maybe from mobile, so we're glad that you could join us in any way. I know you're out working right now as well, so we appreciate everyone's time today.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. Appreciate you having me. Great to join the panel today. Glad to be here, and sorry for the complications getting on.
Not a problem at all. Would you like to kind of walk us through your background? And then I also have some slides from Sam too that I can show as well. So I could pull those up for you, Sam, if you want to give your background, if that's helpful.
That'd be great, Emma.
Great.
Appreciate that.
It's opening up now, but I'll let you get started while I open up this document. Thanks.
Yeah, background, grew up playing a lot of different sports. Basketball was the one I fell in love with, so spent a lot of time playing basketball growing up. And on that slide there, kind of was fortunate enough to get into Westfield State University and make the men's basketball team there. Recruited to play small-time Division III basketball, not the world stage like Kendall, small-time hoops, but it was great because it got me involved with movement sciences, and I really found a passion for working with athletes and working within movement sciences as a broad spectrum. So I was at Westfield from 03 to 08. I was captain of the men's basketball team there and transitioned into different sport performance realms, specifically velocity sport performance, where I was a high performance director, leading into 08, 09, while studying for my master's degree at Bridgewater State University and working as an intern in the strength and conditioning department at Harvard University. So those were kind of my first 3 major stepping stones along my career path. And at Bridgewater, I had a colleague, a mentor, a coach, and a teacher, and Dr. Ellen Robinson, who was just fantastic and took me under her wing, gave me as much time as she could along the way, and really helped me get my foot in the door with the USOC at the time in Colorado Springs. So I transitioned out to Colorado Springs for an internship in 2009, 2010. The USOC at the time couldn't get rid of me. I stayed on as an intern out in Chula Vista, transitioned from Colorado Springs to Chula Vista, and then they created the fellowship role for me to come back to Colorado Springs. And that was supposed to be a 1-year role. 2 years later, I was on through the London Games. Again, they couldn't get rid of me. I was like a bad cough or something like that, where I just kind of kept hanging on and sticking around. In the meantime, it was a lockout season in the NBA, and I had some back and forth with the Golden State Warriors. I was presented an opportunity to transition out to the Bay Area and work with the Golden State Warriors as a secondary performance coach while taking on the lead of athletic development for the Santa Cruz Warriors. I got to do that for a season, had a new opportunity kind of present itself for me to transition down to San Diego, where I had family, working with First MSOB, First Marine Special Operation Battalion, Tier 2 asset for the government within SOCOM, working with MARSOC, Marine Special Operation Command operators, And I took on a direct lead at Camp Pendleton, Area 41 with Delta's team 1, 2, 3, and 4 as a civilian contract strength and conditioning coach. From there, I was able to transition back to the USOC at the time again, down in Chula Vista. Government contracting being what it was, it took about 13 months for the government to realize I was on a contract that probably shouldn't have been created in the first place. So I had no intention of moving on from that role, but I went down to Chula Vista while I was applying for jobs, trying to figure out what I was going to get into. A mentor of mine, Jamie Myers, down in Chula Vista, said, "Why don't you come volunteer?" So I happily did. While I was being offered some jobs back in the collegiate basketball setting, I was approached by the USOC about this new initiative, kind of a startup idea and feel, to try to provide the same level of support and care to our Paralympic athletes that we've been offering to our Olympic athletes at our training centers and sites across the country for 25 plus years at the time. So I was one of the first 2 sport performance providers in that startup, with my boss, Matt Kramer, as a high performance director at the time, my counterpart, Liz Broad, as a senior dietitian. We worked to try to build out a team of, for me, essence strength and conditioning coaches, and for Liz, dietetics. And through the Rio Games, things were starting to get some good momentum behind it. I was offered a position to move out to Colorado Springs and build out the S&C component. So it's now, instead of just me working with, about 50 athletes as the sole S&C provider for the USOC, USOPC now, focusing on Paralympic athletes, we've transitioned to our team is built out. We have multiple dietitians on board now. We have physiologists. We have psychological service support. We have 3 full-time strength and conditioning coaches that I help manage as well. And then we also get to collaborate with our research review group. We get to collaborate with performance and innovation, tech and innovation. We get to collaborate with external environments around our internal processes as well, for our providers to continue to build new best practices from a research and a kind of a research and development initiative. So that's where I'm at now here at the USOPC. I'm now the lead of Para Applied Performance Sciences, which encompasses all those different areas I just mentioned. I also spent some time getting a couple of master's degrees at Australian Catholic University and working with them on a PhD proposal currently. And I guess lecture at a couple of universities like University of Technology of Sydney, University of Colorado Springs, around the use of technology and or best practice support of Paralympic athletes. And that's where I'm at today.
Wow, it's a really impressive career. And it's a good point to our audience that, as we mentioned earlier, there's not a straight path to success. And so we appreciate you giving us your background, Sam. Since we're on it, we're talking about your slides. Would you like to tell us a little bit about what you currently do in your day-to-day and how you use adaptive sports tech? And I believe I'm going to this slide, right?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. I appreciate you taking the lead there.
Yeah.
So in general, I guess if we had to kind of simplify things, for me, I'm a practitioner and a coach at the end of the day, and I try to keep things as simple as possible. And if we're looking at whether it be profiling or monitoring or trying to find information about athletes, there's kind of that internal aspect and external aspect. So an input or output kind of method or theory. Here on the left are just some common pieces of technology that exist across sport. So for me, these technologies exist, and some of them we've been able to work with those companies to try to help adapt and or modify for the para athlete. But here on the left, you see some of these components that we might interact with on a regular basis. Whether it's monitoring heart rate, resting heart rate, HRV, whether it's monitoring maybe DEXA or bone scans, maybe it's respiratory considerations, it might be lactate considerations, or just health and wellness questionnaires. So those are some of the common pieces of technology that we interact with on a regular basis. Not all encompassing, but probably the ones that we might see most commonly. And then if we shift to the right here, we'll look at some of those kind of output measurements. So now looking at things that we actually produce versus things that are happening internally, so external measurements. And it could be something as simple as a stopwatch or tape measure or a goniometer, or it could be as complex as using force plates or using linear position transducers or accelerometers, magnetometers. It could be using the force frame, could be using different video technologies. These are all different components that we interact with on a regular basis to try to monitor, to profile, and to help us kind of create new best practice programming for the athletes that we support and serve. And then the last component, as these technologies have grown and developed in the last 10 years specifically, I've only been paid to be a practitioner for about 15, going on 16. I'd say in the last 10 years, it seems like every year you turn around, there's a new piece of technology out there challenging the status quo. So now, how do we aggregate that information? How do we make that information transition seamlessly to dashboards and reports that actually can enforce meaningful change and not just have everything live in a silo? So that's kind of become its own little area as well, is taking this information, translating that information, and making it as meaningful as possible for the coaches, for the athletes, and for the support staff that serve the athletes on a regular basis.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think talking about, how do you serve the athletes? I think we should throw to Kendall. Kendall, you and Sam work together. So do you want to tell us a little bit about how you work with adaptive sports tech and what your day-to-day looks like for training and competition? And anything that, Sam has brought up as well, as one of his athletes.
Yeah, so yeah, I get to work with Sam often, every week. But yeah, we have a lot of different technology that we're using day to day. And as para athletes, adaptive athletes, that technology is I would say maybe a little bit more heightened in our daily use of it. Because if we're just talking about the equipment that we're using to compete in our sport, all of it is technology based. So I do have some slides as well that I'll share just to show you guys the equipment that I'm using, just so you guys are familiar with what that looks like for me. So yeah, as a triathlete, I'm using a lot of different equipment, but also as a Nordic skier. So I'll have a couple of different pieces to show you. So this first picture is me in what's called the racing wheelchair. So this is the run equivalent for me in a triathlon. You can see I'm using these special gloves on my hands, and then there's a ring on the wheel. So I'm not actually like grabbing the ring or anything. It's all interacting between this special glove and then the ring that's on the wheel here. The next piece of equipment that I use often is a bike. So this is called a hand cycle. Again, it's all powered through your arms. And then, but otherwise it is pretty similar to just like a standard bicycle. It has gears and everything. And then kind of built within this piece of equipment, another tool that I'm using is a power meter. So that's tracking my output as an athlete on the bike. And that's something that I'm looking at often. Sam mentioned heart rate, but power is also a really key indicator for me on the bike as to what I'm doing and how I'm training. And then the final main piece of equipment that I'm using day to day. So this is my sit ski that I use in the winter season. And I wanted to show you guys this picture because it really shows how unique all of the equipment needs to be in the para space, and it has to be adapted for every individual athlete. So these are two of my teammates on the Nordic team. And as you could see, we're all in very different setups. And so you really have to find what is going to help you be adapted best to your ability and capability as an athlete, and help you perform to the best of your ability.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing those pictures. And as later in this discussion, we'll talk about customization, as Kendall brought up, and how that is specific to each athlete. So I appreciate that. Seong-Hee, can you walk us through a little bit of your day today and what
Sure.
adaptive sports tech looks like for you?
Of course. So I kind of went through briefly my role at Michigan Medicine, and as Sam was talking about his kind of view or like his like life or path to sports tech, adaptive sports tech, I was looking at my side and I realized the UNC is really the only past one, and everything else is still happening. So believe it or not, adaptive sports is a portion of my day-to-day, but as a rehab engineer full-time, I'm basically accessibility and assistive technology is my entire world, and sports is a portion of that. So working with people with disabilities in the sports space, in the gaming space, in the day-to-day space. So as a rehab engineer day-to-day, Michigan Medicine is a level 1 trauma hospital. So I see patients coming in from traumatic accident or after a stroke. It might literally be from like a survival flight into the hospital, and I might see them right away. So from that point through inpatient rehab, I'm seeing the patient through. And so that could mean, I have some slides of, let's see, lots of photos, and it's all over the place. So like if this slide is really overwhelming, that's because that's kind of my like day-to-day looks like. So actually just today, you know, I'm doing an adaptive gaming event. So top left up here, this is a mouth joystick set up for a kiddo that a patient kiddo patient that I had. We're at the Children's Hospital here. She's able to play with adaptive controls video game with her dad bedside, and then the middle photo in the background is obviously the adaptive sports portion of my day-to-day. And then sometimes I'm adapting beat bow toys bottom left. So this is me being very much an engineer soldering. And then on the right is one of my adult patients that was set up with the mouth joystick so that he could access his tablet. And that tablet ended up being his way to control all of his like smart home technology. So everything that has to do with accessibility is my day-to-day. And then and so that's kind of how I made it into the adaptive sports tech world. And my role within UMAISE, the adaptive sports program here, is really making sure that we pick out the right equipment off the shelf, as well as making adaptations. And we're a multidisciplinary team. So we have recreational therapists, physiatrists, physical therapists, and occupational therapists. So I think that that's kind of the beauty of a well-rounded adaptive sports program, in that you have the different skill sets. And I'd say I would be the one that kind of will know when like there's a red flag for like if an equipment is not going to be right. And same thing with adaptive equipment, as well as assistive technology that you might use for accessing different technologies. So this is another slew of photos. You have a kiddo up top left being able to communicate with just her eye movements. And then in the middle, she's doing homework with her mouth movements. So what I do day to day, a lot of the equipment I have to pick off the shelf. So like I have to be up to date on what is out there and what is going to be accessible for a specific person. And that applies for the adaptive sports world too. You don't want to reinvent the wheel if there's equipment out there. But like Kendall mentioned, every person, every adaptive athlete, it's going to need some customization, if not like complete customization. So that is kind of my day-to-day, whether or not I'm working in the adaptive sports scope, or working on giving somebody access to their technologies, or in kind of the recreation space for gaming.
Thank you, Seong-Hee. We appreciate your expertise in this area, as I know that you have lots of experience, as you've shown, across the accessible world. And Kendall, do you think you could explain to our audience a little bit about what barriers that athletes with disabilities face, and the kind of different types of tech that people can use to overcome these boundaries?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's really important to remember as athletes is we're also using assistive equipment throughout our day-to-day lives. So whether if you're an amputee, you're using a prosthetic limb, and or as like a wheelchair user, you're using a wheelchair all day. I use forearm crutches and braces, and I think that's really important to remember, because all of those pieces of equipment are also going to have an impact on your life as an athlete. So if you're having an issue, for example, if you're having an issue with your prosthetic leg and how that's fitting, and that's potentially causing a problem in your day-to-day life, that is also going to have an impact on your sport and your ability to train and compete. And so it's just this added layer that you have to be cognizant of. I don't think it's something that's like, yeah, it's not to say that other elite athletes don't have other things in their day-to-day life that they have to think about, but they're these really key pieces of equipment that you have to be dialed in, so that you can have your sole focus be on being an athlete and competing at the top level. Yeah, so I think that's just like an additional barrier of something that we're thinking about, and that yeah, it's day-to-day stuff and not just the sporting equipment.
Kendall, does that mean also for like the space as well? We run into that with our athletes through UMAISE. this?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think so. I'm really lucky in that I live and train out of the Olympic and Paralympic Training Center in Colorado Springs, which is in a very adapted and accessible space to be in. It's like built with athletes in mind, but that's definitely not the case. You know, most of my winter I'm on the road and I'm traveling, and so we are in a lot of spaces that are not accessible. I think winter in general is not accessible. It's like a very you know, you're on ice or on snow where it's slippery, or like pushing through snow in a wheelchair is a really difficult task. And again, I think that's another level of troubleshooting that our support staff has to go through, of not just thinking about how they can support us best as athletes, but what are the barriers that we're going to be facing just from the fact that we're competing in a winter sport, and that is like conditions of a rough environment, or, you know, the gyms that we're going to. Sam has a lot of, like, the gym is set up for a lot of exercises for us, and there's small things there. It's like when I'm lifting, I often use a Velcro strap for some of the lifts that I'm doing, but if I'm traveling, I don't always have access to that. And so it's learning what are the different exercises that I can accomplish the same thing without the same equipment that I normally have access to. So I think, Seong-Hee, you said it before, but just like constantly being creative and thinking outside of the box, that's something that we have to do as well in training, especially when you're not in the most accessible spaces.
We run into that problem with UMAISE as well. We're more of a community-based program with multiple levels of, as far as like competitiveness. We have kids playing wheelchair basketball that may be the only wheelchair user at school. And so accessibility at every level becomes, I think, such a headache for adaptive sports, and that one, if the kid or an adult is in the world, they may be the only person that might need adaptations. And then to think about, then do you play with other, you know, players that may not need adaptations? And also adaptations are expensive, so financial barriers are a huge one too. Whereas you can go to a store and just buy a kiddie tennis racket for $20 and try out to see if you like tennis, or even like a basketball. You might be able to go to just a YMCA and they might lend you a basketball, and of course the ball still is involved when you play wheelchair basketball, but you have the sports chair as well. So all of that equipment is already expensive, and you don't even know if that investment is going to be worth it or not. Sam, you're nodding. Yeah.
Yeah, and Emma, I don't know, I had a couple of little slides there too, just around some of the equipment that I had to utilize. There's one slide with some classic gym equipment. Yeah, thank you. So like Kendall was talking about, I mean, just from like an S&C focus, if we're just talking about supporting an athlete from a physical preparation or athletic development standpoint, on the top left there's some tools I utilize that aren't necessarily adapted for the adaptive athlete, but they're tools that we wouldn't necessarily see at like an NC2A collegiate weight room or at a classic sport performance facility. But for me, they've become pretty pivotal tools. So something like a bench pull, that top left there, it's kind of fallen by the wayside in the last 20 years as far as like big facilities may not have them anymore. But for like Kendall, we use it all the time, and she might she might be getting sick of seeing that because she uses it so often. But I can now reprofile athletes. I can assess their neuromuscular readiness. I can give them bandwidths of velocities to train with for specific adaptations. We can train that tool, and we've adapted that tool to give us more information for the para athlete than we would have had without it. And the same could go for a multi-hip or an assisted squat machine, where now we can actually create new profiles that we've made in-house and validated in-house to better assist the para athlete for individualized considerations for specific training adaptations, which without those tools, I'd have a hard time maybe getting that specific and that granular for those athletes, like Kendall herself mentioned. In the middle there, we see some just basic assistive equipment that may exist for or not for adaptive athletes, something like active hands, or we might use gymnastics hooks or different grip assisting technologies to help athletes adapt their hand to a cable machine, to a band, to a dumbbell. And without those tools, those athletes might not be able to move, external resistance as easily. We use squat wedges all the time. I'm kind of obsessed with them. I've had, 10 degrees, 15 degrees, 20 degrees, 30 degrees. I have unilateral ones, I have bilateral ones, because athletes with amputation, like Kendall mentioned, if they're coming in and training on a day leg or even a running leg, we have to find ways to kind of accommodate for the fact that they don't have an ankle. They don't have proprioception ability coming through the floor to their foot on that side. And we have to find ways to make them stable and find ways for them to actually get that pitch that their opposite ankle, if it is a unilateral amputation, is creating. There's an example of that gait belt right there in the middle. We use that for chair transfers. We might use those to actually help an athlete be strapped down to that bench pull, like Kendall mentioned. And just finding different tools that exist to find ways to create creative solutions for the athletes to get the stimulus they need to be the best in the world at what they're doing. Down there at the right, taking a classic force plate setup. Luckily, sports medicine at the Olympic and Paralympic Training Center in Colorado Springs, when I got to town, they were willing to collaborate with me to recreate. We created custom eye bolts there on the sides, and we're able to actually ratchet a barbell down to racks that we got with 1-inch adjustments for very specific details for athletes that we can do isometric assessments. So just using force plates for classic jump assessments may not give us the same information we need for athletes who maybe can't jump, or maybe jumping isn't a part of their sport, and jumping on one leg isn't going to give us the same information as jumping on two legs does. So adapting technology that does exist to help us find ways to continue to push athletes further in their journey is something I have to deal with on a regular basis. And Kendall kind of mentioned, when you go overseas, you might have some challenges if a gym's not set up for an athlete with those considerations.
Absolutely. And Sam, I know in a lot of our conversations, we've talked about customization, and you brought it up here, how everything is equally as customized. How does that look like? You talked about the day leg versus a running leg. Do you think you could explain to our audience kind of daily life versus training versus competition even, and how that transfers with the type of tech that's necessary?
Yeah, and Kendall did a great job of hitting on it. She's living it on a daily basis, so she's a great resource in that space. But the way I've looked at it while assisting athletes with known physical impairments and disabilities, like we have kind of three buckets where their technology comes into play, their specific supportive technology. There's the interface of the athlete with their technology in locomotion or sporting movement. So like Kendall using that hand cycle, or Kendall using that push chair, she's then using a piece of technology in the actual sport to locomate, to challenge that stopwatch, right? And that's what we kind of consider. A lot of times we look at some of the chair sport pieces of technology, or we consider like the running legs or day legs, right? So a running leg, maybe it's a cheetah, a J cup, a C cup. There's different legs that might produce different potential variables to help an athlete propel themselves forward. But then there's also that second component that Kendall talked about in their daily life, where we might have day legs or day chairs. And as a physical preparation coach, or as a applied performance scientist, and working with sports medicine professionals, what we see over time is a lot of athletes acquire chronic injuries, soft tissue injuries related more to the fitting of their daily equipment versus their sporting equipment. It can happen both ways, but what we see is sometimes the sporting equipment goes through these extra layers of special ergonomic fitting for the athlete and the individual. And sometimes that can be adapted, hopefully, for an athlete every couple of years or every quad, whereas sometimes they're using the same day equipment over and over and over without those adaptations or special modifications. And because they're using it so often, if it's a athlete with an SCI and they're using a day chair and they're going to the pool in the morning to swim, if they're a triathlete, but then they get back in their day chair, they go to the calf, and then they go back to their push session for their run session. And they're in a push chair that's maybe a little bit better for their shoulder from an ergonomic fit standpoint. But then they're back in their day chair to go get another snack or lunch and go get some recovery. Then they use that chair to go back to their hand cycle that might be fit for them specifically, but they're getting in and out of that day chair to get to and from training throughout the day. And throughout the day, we see athletes who can accumulate 20 to 30,000 pushes in that day chair that may not ever actually go through the same level of customization for that athlete that their sporting equipment does. So from a soft tissue injury risk standpoint, that's something that we have to really focus on as a performance staff and a medical staff, to try to keep athletes healthy so they can continue to train in their sport. Outside of that, there's this third bucket where there are some athletes who compete in sport that the sporting equipment is made for able-bodied athletes. So somebody like in rowing or canoe, like they might be using a boat that's the same setup for an able-bodied athlete, for a collegiate athlete who's over at Princeton, let's say, using the same size oar and same size paddle, but they might not have legs past their knees, and they're not the same fit as the athletes that equipment was initially intended for. So you have the daily use, you have the equipment in the actual sporting demands, but then you have equipment made not for the para-athletes considerations that the para-athlete then has to use in sport. So there's kind of three tiers to that puzzle, all of which is good for performance and medical staff to be aware of, to try to help keep athletes healthy and safe so they can continue to pursue their dreams and goals.
Sam, when you mentioned like the additional pushes and the day-to-day equipment not being as customized as the competition equipment, that made me kind of think about when I see my rehab patients, their focus when they come through the inpatient rehab is the physical rehab. So they're in physical therapy, occupational therapy, and speech therapy for at least 3 hours a day. So when I get to see them and talk about just technology, which is more so the day-to-day, hey, can you use your phone? That applies for the adaptive athletes too. I may pick an adaptive equipment that's way easy for them because I have to preserve their strength. So like they might have some shoulder movement, they might have some arm movement, but I probably wouldn't push them to use a adapted joystick that uses an arm movement. Rather, I might use their mouth movement, because knowing that like they're focusing on like preserving their strength for the rest of it. And as you're talking, I was like, oh, that also applies to really competitive athletes as well. You might choose different adaptive equipment at home, or use things that are like at home, maybe like smart home tech. So having your entire home connected to your phone, even though you physically could roll up to, or get to a thermostat or something like that, if you're having a rest day and you're really like elite athlete, that it's got to be different. So the fact that there's technology out there, and my whole big like what do you call it, soapbox, is like going back to the barrier thing. A lot of the adaptive sports and adaptive sports equipment, or adaptive equipment in general, assistive technology, the big barrier is availability and price. And I think that my big belief is that when big companies, big industry or industry companies focus on accessibility and come up with products that are part of their standard line and bring down the price. And I don't know if it's like a shameless plug, but I actually brought 3 of the Nike Fly Eases. I bought all 3 of them because they're the same price as any other of their shoes. And the fact that Nike like focused on accessibility and made their shoes look really cool, I really appreciate that. And I feel like that applies to all the other assistive technology work, like needs and barriers.
Yeah, and that's a fantastic point. I mean, you talk about when we're considering not just daily life for somebody with a physical disability, if we're considering chasing being the best in the world in a specific sport in Paralympics, on the Olympic side, if it's a runner, they might have time where they're off feet on purpose, right? But if it's Kendall and she's got to use her assistive technology to get around, she's still using those same joints, same limbs, same soft tissue, ligaments, everything else that she would in her competition. So finding those ways to promote recovery and deloading of those joints over time is fantastic. And when you bring up the barriers, I mean, some of these elite athletes I work with, they might be using the same, let's just pick on Kendall's Nordic example. Maybe it's the same sit ski. It could be anything in any para sport, but they might be using that same setting and same fitting for 4 to 6 to 8 years, because if they don't have the funds to always get it adapted and fitted. And with that, we're still kind of just scratching the surface of what we know around efficiency. And this idea of optimization, it's kind of a philosophical conundrum, because what is optimal, right? Like what is optimal today for Kendall probably wasn't optimal for Kendall 4 years earlier. As an athlete adapts and becomes stronger and faster, and potentially leaner, or whatever the sporting demands require, what the fitting was that it was optimal for them when it was made, chances are that no longer holds true after a year to 2 years to 3 years to 4 years. And the barriers for even the most elite athletes we have in the U.S. Paralympics, them being able to get those ergonomic considerations made on a regular basis, it's still a barrier for a lot of the athletes that I support on a regular basis. And we're talking about the elite levels of U.S. sport.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'll kind of add to that. I think, yeah, when we're talking about optimizing your equipment, it's thinking, I kind of think about it as two contexts, maybe. Like, yeah, you're developing as an athlete, so the equipment needs to develop with you, but you also have to think that the Paralympic space is progressing so quickly. And so what was like would cut it to be at the top of sport 4 years ago is not the case now. You really have to have, you can't just have equipment that's like good for you. It really has to be optimized for you. And I think that's where one of the barriers that we have is knowing what those next steps are. Like, that's a really big conversation that our team is having, is how do we optimize equipment? And some of the questions that we're asking or paths that we're going down, it's like we're asking questions that no one's asked before, maybe, or we don't know what the answers are. Whereas, you know, just say a cyclist, there's a little bit more of a straightforward path. There's a lot of research that's done on like what's a good bike fit and what does that look like? What components should I be using? And that's just not the case necessarily for para athletes. There's not those like big known questions out there. And so we're starting to ask these questions of optimization that like there's not an answer to yet. So you have to be finding the right people to connect to find those answers, and that can help you answer those questions, which is not always an easy task. And yeah, and also to Sam's point about equipment and the expense of it, yeah, like that is a major barrier. I think it's pretty common that you'll see athletes where, you know, they might be getting a new bike every single year or something like that. But to put it in perspective, the hand cycle that I have is $16,000. Like that's a lot of money. That's like a car, basically. And so that's just not something that you can be buying every single year. And so when you're trying to optimize that equipment, you have to think about, okay, like I can't buy a $16,000 piece of equipment every year, but what are the components of it that I can optimize that are going to give me the most benefit, that are going to help me improve as an athlete?
Emma, so next time we do another adaptive, how I get into adaptive sports tech, you'll need to add a researcher that only does adaptive sports research.
Yes,
That could be
absolutely.
like
I was
another
just thinking
panelist.
that of who are the experts? Who are we looking to? I mean, who do you all look to when you're looking at experts in this space? I know you all are each experts yourselves in this space, but is there any you know, body of work or place that you look where you say that's truly the cutting edge? Or is it this all something that, you know, you're internally, if you want to figure something out, you have to troubleshoot yourself?
A little bit of both, Sam, right? You know, you could look into just the standard sports research, or look into the medical model and look at, you know, physical activity through medical journals. But really, there's not much out there on adaptive sports and adaptive sports performance.
Yeah, and luckily, what is out there is meaningful. I think sometimes we have this kind of publish or peril mindset within publications in general, within medicine and performance, where people are putting things out to put things out. What literature does exist in, whether it be adaptive sport or specifically Paralympic sport, is very meaningful. So that's a positive. And from where I sit, 15 years ago, you know, I talked about technically 13 years ago, 2010, being introduced to para sport for the first time at Colorado Springs. You know, having been introduced to a visually impaired athlete, thinking I was an okay coach, and saying, okay, now you got to teach me how to power clean. And that was my intro to para sport. Somebody who can't see anything you're doing. With that, back in 2010, the amount of literature that was out there was exponentially less than what it is now. So even in about a decade's time, we're seeing more and more and more interest. And it's funny you're asking about experts. One person I view as an expert from Loughborough University is why I'm on the road today. I'm going to meet with her after this call for dinner and be at our lecture tomorrow afternoon. And there are different hubs throughout the world that are starting to really focus on the adaptive and or Paralympic athlete. And Loughborough University is one example in the UK, and there's a group in Brazil, and there's a group in Norway, and there's different groups who are starting to do more and more in that space. And we're talking about Paralympic sport with Kendall as a prime example of somebody who's super successful in that scope. I think in the US, a lot of people just don't have a lot of understanding of what parasport is initially, unless they've been exposed to it. But Paralympics are the third largest sporting event in the world. You know, you go back to London, 2.4 million tickets were sold. Rio, they did maybe not as great of a job of cataloging it, but somewhere between 2.2 and 2.3 million tickets sold off the top of my head. And off the top of my pre-brain again, I would say Tokyo, when they released ticket sales, it was 3.2 million sold out in the first week. But again, because of the pandemic, there were no live spectators, but it was going to be the largest Paralympic sporting event for summer history. And as that recognition grows in the US, I would imagine hopefully more and more people in the US who have a background not just in maybe human performance, but maybe actual engineering and all these other components that make up the adaptive technology and equipment that we're talking about might be more and more inclined to be interested in getting involved as we move forward. And I really hope that after LA 2028, when we have more exposure around the games here in the US for the US sport hungry culture that we have, as they learn more about Paralympic Games, hopefully with good education around what it is they're witnessing, there'll be more and more qualified individuals out there who might be more interested and more inclined to chip in and try to help.
Absolutely. That was going to be one of my questions as well, is kind of what do we think the future of adaptive sports tech looks like? So thank you, Sam, for getting us started on that. And I will encourage the audience as well. Please drop any questions you have in the chat, in the Q&A function. We'd love to get to the audience questions as well.
Before we jump to the audience
Yeah.
questions, could I quickly go through some of the equipment that UMAISE uses? I know we focused a
Absolutely.
lot on the kind of the high competitive Paralympic level, but I think not everyone's going to be an Olympian, right? And so UMAISE, what we do is we provide community free, most of them free events to the community for kids and adults. So I just wanted to share some of the equipment that we provide the equipment. And I mentioned before that the equipment's expensive. So there's some examples of kayaking equipment. So you see here with somebody with an amputation that there's a podium that the paddle sits on. There's lateral support, so somebody who might not have as much trunk control or has had a spinal cord injury. Also, the fact that it's a tandem kayak, you can ride with someone else. So all those like very custom adaptations. Even though these two kayaks are both tandem kayaks, they're different tandem kayaks. Oh wait, sorry, I didn't click the share. So thank you. So yeah, so these are some examples of kayak adaptations and a adaptive dock where you can do a slide transfer into the kayak, and lateral supports if you have not a strong trunk control, adaptations for your hand, and then if you really can't get into the water, we've done virtual kayaking, which I think is kind of the pinnacle of inclusive sports. Creating ability is where we get all of our equipment. Again, going back to like as a adaptive sports programmer or rehab engineer, we get the equipment either from off the shelf or Creating Ability makes really awesome products. So I would get products from their website and then make small adjustments based on the participant. So I'll just go quickly through those. These are some hand adaptations that you would decide on depending on the participant's disability. So if you have weakened grip strength, you might use a hand adaptation like this, or this would work for somebody who has an amputation with wrapped around their residual limb. And here's the podium stand for the paddle. I was making these slides and I realized we have a lot of equipment. So we provide all the equipment for all of our events. So this is an example of walker soccer, but we ended up having a lot of crutch users as well. So forearm crutches, that allows these kids to be able to play soccer. And then down at the bottom right, very advanced technology, a little bumper that I put onto a manual chair. So the walkers were off the shelf, crutches were custom fit from their doctors, and then the bumper is what an adaptation that I would make at the clinic to allow this little girl to be able to play soccer with the rest of the group. Sports chair is different than a regular chair. So the top left is an example of a all sport chair that has a guard in the front. Bottom is a tennis sports chair. So that's different. So there are different kinds of sports chairs. And then these two photos I wanted to include to show that you can't just play with one person. So if you want to join a wheelchair basketball team, everybody has to have the equipment. So as a programmer, you do have to have a big chunk of funding and a big number of wheelchairs to get started in multiple different sizes. Tennis, there's combination of just wrapping your hand, or we've even worked with an OMP office here to custom fit the mold. And then also on the left, we worked with the student design team to see if there's a brace that we can come up with. But with holding a tennis racket and the movement of it, you want it to be really strong and rigid, but also have flexibility. So there's some design challenges in that. And then camping. So UMAISE has 13 different sports and recreational activities. Hiking, hand cycling, basketball, tree climbing, and camping is probably one of my favorites because it is the most inclusive, that we can make it the most inclusive. And camping, we specifically decided not to try to get specialized equipment, but make smart decisions to make this activity inclusive and adapted for individuals with disabilities. And so here you'll see this cot is just a regular camping cot, but the decision to get a cot makes the transfer for a wheelchair user to get onto the bed much easier than down to the ground. And this tent, you'll see a little lamp icon. That means that there's a port for a power plug. So making the right decisions on the campground, making the decision to find an accessible campground that has power for equipment that you need to plug into, like a ventilator or a feeding machine, and picking the s'more sticks that have wider grip and telescoping arm that makes it just inherently more accessible. And then down here, you'll see this girl up at the table. This table is an accessible table, so it leaves room for the wheelchair to roll in. So doing research and picking the campsite that would be most accessible are ways that without adding any more funding than just the inherent activity itself, to make the sport or recreation a lot more inclusive. And also camping, I really love because we get to bring the whole family along, and it doesn't have to be, it's not a big deal, it's not an issue. It's not whether you have a disability or not, it's just a whole family activity. So I love that about camping. And I think this is the last slide. So some of our other sports. Down at the bottom is a Grit Freedom Chair, which is a hiking chair. It's a mix between a manual wheelchair and a mountain bike. It was invented out of MIT. And so you push the arm. So in the middle, you see the girl sitting there, and you push the arm bars forward, and it's got these big giant tires that make going through rough terrains possible. On the top left are some examples of hand cycles, and then top right is a photo from our tree climbing event. So regardless of ability level, you are able to tree climb. And then down at the bottom left is a photo from our sports club, adult sports club. It's adaptive martial arts. And so sometimes the adaptation just has to be from a seating position, or like the clinician or the coach knowing the individual and like how to customize that movement for the individual. So some of the equipment, and so I just wanted to like go quickly through that.
Yeah, I think that's a great visualization for our audience as well to see. And I know we talked about previously as well, as that camping's a great example. I think it's relatable for everyone to understand kind of just the barriers that someone would face if they're trying to go camping. So I think we have 2 audience questions, and I think we'll hopefully have time to finish them both. But first audience question, is there any adaptive technology available or being developed for intellectually disabled athletes?
So for people with intellectual or cognitive disabilities, our adult sports club is a good example of some activities. Technology usually isn't the answer for making it inclusive. I think the coaching staff knowing how to adapt the activity to the individual ends up being the answer, kind of the human factor. And so for our program, we lean on our recreational therapists who are experts at adapting activities to meet the needs of participants that have cognitive or intellectual disabilities. We have used communication boards for people who might use communication boards if you have a cognitive disability or impairment. Especially for kayaking, when we get them onto the kayak, we've laminated communication boards with icons that say basic needs. So we've done that before, but I feel like generally with that population, that usually is having the right staff members.
Yeah, and I think Seong-Hee did a great job of summing it up. I'm happy to hear a little bit of confirmation bias there, because I do think the interaction with the staff itself is probably imperative. In my realm, working in Paralympic sport, when we consider cognitive disabilities, usually when we look at that impairment overview, we're talking about athletes with traumatic brain injuries, or we're talking about athletes who are on the spectrum with autism. And those are the two kind of common examples that I'll interact with. And I think a lot of that comes back to learning how to teach. Like if you can find a way to make sure that you're meeting the athlete where they're at and not jumping steps. So not trying to throw something too complicated out right at once, but finding ways to meet the athlete where they're at. Some athletes really respond well to demonstration and shadowing versus verbal cueing. Some athletes really respond well to more of external cueing versus internal cueing, but finding ways as a practitioner to really make sure you're teaching to the individual and not thinking about it from your perspective only. I think that's kind of a simple step in that direction, and that might not necessarily include a specific piece of technology, but I think the interaction with the staff is really important for the staff to understand what it is they're doing and how they're educating those individuals, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Thank you both for answering that question. And Kendall, to end this wonderful conversation, I know that we could probably talk for many more hours, but answering another audience question and one question that I had as well. How do you suggest that we inspire young future Paralympians? This is from WIS founder and CEO Mary Lou McFarland. She said, "The future is so bright. Thank you to all of you for the incredible work that you do." So what does the future of Paralympics look like, and how are you inspiring the next generation?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, visibility seems so important. And yeah, I think about my own story where I really didn't find out what the Paralympics were, what that would mean for me as someone growing up with a disability until I was in college. And so that's where it's really important. And again, Sam mentioned it earlier about how LA 28 can be so transformational. I completely agree with that. It's having these athletes see another athlete that looks like them and realizing that they have that as an option available to them, that it's a possibility. And I think that goes really far, of being able to see someone like you competing in a sport. And yeah, so I think it's, you know, the Paralympics have every 4 years, every 2 years with the Winter Paralympics. But there's competitions going on every single year, all the time. And so making that accessible and visible to athletes with a disability, I think is key for inspiring them.
Well, thank you so much, Kendall. We really appreciate you being here and sharing your expertise as well. And we are so proud of you representing Team USA so well. As I'm not sure if I mentioned earlier, Kendall is a gold medal winner, and she, during the picture that she showed, I mean, Sam or Kendall could probably tell you better, but the picture she showed before, Sam, I'll let you jump in, because Sam explained this to me gave a little background on the picture that Kendall showed before. Had goosebumps.
Kendall is as humble of an athlete as I've ever worked with. She is dominant in multiple levels of Paralympic sport. She's had a great career, but she's also a great person, great human. So as a coach, you can't really ask for much more than that, right? But with that photo of her in her pushchair, I don't know if Kendall's probably gonna be too bashful to pull it back up, but that is her finishing in Tokyo 2021 on the blue carpet as she approaches her final sprint to beat out her main competitor from Australia in the very, very end of the triathlon event in Tokyo 2021. And she just ekes by her and just keeps cruising for the finish. And that photo is a part of that blue carpet finish. And Kendall, being who she is, she probably wasn't going to point that out, but me being the annoying coach, I was going to point it out for her.
Well, thank you, Sam. I think it's an amazing visual with a even more amazing story. So at WIST, we are so honored that we were able to have you all on this panel and to talk about adaptive sports tech. We appreciate all the work that you're doing in this area. And I'm so sorry we didn't get to all the audience questions, but thank you all for being a great audience and interactive. Definitely, you can find all of our panelists on LinkedIn if you want to ask them an individual question as well. This recording will be available on our website, so you can go back and rewatch and share with anyone who had missed it. But I just want to say thank you all so much to all of our wonderful panelists and to our audience for being here. Appreciate it, everyone. Have a good night.
Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.